The calm before the storm. The feeling of déjà vu was almost palpable as Jade Montgomery glided through the terminal of Boston Logan International Airport. It was early, before the usual rush, and yet there was an undeniable hum in the air, a quiet pulse that mirrored her own focus. This was her world, a place she knew inside and out. From the early morning hustle of travelers to the distant echoes of announcements reverberating through the cold metal and glass, everything seemed orchestrated and precise. Jade moved through it all with a purpose. At 32, she had already cemented herself as a force in the corporate world, a sharp, focused woman whose success was built on integrity, intelligence, and relentless drive. Though she had inherited much of her mother's business acumen and the prestige of the Montgomery name, she never relied on it. Jade had always been adamant that her work should speak for itself. Her navy blue suit, tailored to perfection, hugged her frame with a sophisticated simplicity that conveyed authority without arrogance. It was the kind of outfit that didn't scream for attention but commanded it all the same. Her shoulder-length hair, impeccably styled, moved with the breeze as she walked through the terminal, her eyes scanning the crowd around her. She was always alert, always aware of her surroundings, even if she didn't outwardly show it. Her mother, Alexandra Montgomery, had instilled in her a sense of resilience from a young age. Alexandra, a self-made CEO of a powerful airline empire, was known not just for her business acumen but for her unyielding stance in the face of challenges. She had taught Jade how to be steadfast in adversity, how to rise above judgment, and how to handle those who doubted or underestimated her. And Jade had taken those lessons to heart. Every day, every meeting, every challenge was an opportunity to prove herself. Not to the world, but to herself. She knew her worth. As Jade approached the check-in counter, her mind wandered briefly to the upcoming meeting she was set to attend. This trip, a quick flight to New York, was just another stepping stone toward securing a deal that would solidify her place among the top executives in the industry. The partnership she was negotiating wasn't just business, it was about proving that she had what it took to drive change and innovation in a world that often favored the old guard. But first, she had to get on the plane. Her steps were measured, confident, and deliberate. The airport, bustling as it was, seemed to fade into the background as she focused solely on the task at hand. She handed over her ticket to the gate agent, who smiled in recognition before ushering her toward the priority boarding line. For all the opulence of first class, Jade never took it for granted. It wasn't about luxury, it was about efficiency, comfort, and getting things done in the most productive way possible. Her seat in the front cabin was waiting for her. An oasis of space and quiet in the midst of the usual chaos that came with air travel. She had always loved the calm of first class, the feeling of separation from the frenzied crowds in the economy cabin. Here, everything was designed to make the journey smoother, more pleasant. The flight attendants knew her name, the smooth leather chairs offered maximum comfort, and the champagne was always just the right temperature. This was where Jade thrived, where her mind could clear, her thoughts could sharpen, and she could prepare herself for the next step. But as she made her way toward the first-class section, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was subtle at first, just a whisper in the back of her mind. The glances from some of the passengers, the looks exchanged between flight attendants, even the way people seemed to move aside as she walked past, all of it felt slightly off. She pushed the feeling aside. After all, she had been flying for years, never once feeling out of place. But today was different. As Jade neared her seat, she saw the flight attendant, Victoria Sinclair, watching her with an intensity that made her pause. Victoria's gaze wasn't the typical professional look that Jade was used to, there was something in her eyes, something unreadable. A flicker of confusion, perhaps, or suspicion. Jade's gaze met hers, and she held it for a moment longer than usual. A quiet challenge seemed to pass between them, though it was unspoken. "Excuse me, miss," Victoria said, her voice pitched slightly higher than necessary. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Jade, taken aback by the sudden scrutiny, reached into her bag without hesitation, retrieving the small, familiar piece of paper. She handed it over with a calm smile, though inside, she felt a flutter of unease. There was no reason for this kind of question. She was in first class, the seat had been reserved, and everything was in order. The attendant took the boarding pass, glanced at it briefly, and then scanned it again as though she hadn't quite seen what she was looking for. Jade watched her, now fully aware that something was amiss. It wasn't just a question, it felt like a challenge. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, her tone now more strained. "There seems to be some confusion. Let me double-check." Jade felt her patience begin to thin. She had experienced her share of awkward encounters in the past, but this was different. This was not a simple mistake. She could feel the weight of the situation hanging in the air, and she knew that the suspicion wasn't just about a boarding pass. It was something more insidious, something personal. She nodded, forcing a smile. "Take your time," she said, though her voice was tighter now. Victoria walked away, holding the boarding pass in her hand, and Jade took a moment to collect herself. Her thoughts raced. What was going on? She had flown countless times without incident, always with the quiet assumption that she belonged. But now, in this moment, something about the way Victoria had treated her felt like a judgment, an insinuation that she wasn't supposed to be there, that she didn't belong in this space. Jade had been on the receiving end of judgment before. As a black woman in a world dominated by powerful, predominantly white figures, she had encountered prejudice and doubt throughout her life. But she had learned long ago how to deflect it, how to carry herself with a sense of quiet power that silenced those who would question her. But today, it seemed as though the world wasn't ready to let her go unnoticed. Minutes passed before Victoria returned, her expression unreadable. She handed back the boarding pass with a nod and a terse smile. "You're all set," she said, her voice no longer carrying the same edge, though it was clear that something still lingered in the air between them. Jade didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, taking the boarding pass from Victoria's hand and stepping past her into the first-class cabin. The seat was waiting for her, but the usual comfort she found in it was gone. Instead, Jade felt a growing sense of frustration. This wasn't just about an uncomfortable exchange, it was a statement. As she settled into her seat, she glanced around the cabin, scanning the faces of the other passengers. No one seemed to notice, or care, what had just transpired. That, too, bothered her. This wasn't just about being treated unfairly, it was about the lack of awareness, the quiet complicity in allowing someone to be made to feel small. The flight attendants went about their duties, offering drinks and snacks, their professional smiles plastered on their faces. But Jade knew that the moment she had just experienced was anything but professional. It was an act of subtle exclusion, one that made her feel like an outsider in a space that was supposed to be welcoming. Jade closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain her composure. But the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just a woman in a seat. She was Jade Montgomery, the daughter of Alexandra Montgomery, the CEO of the very airline that was now making her feel invisible. And if anyone was going to make her feel small today, it wasn't going to be a flight attendant. Jade's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to let this moment pass. Not this time. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's mistake. It was about standing up, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been made to feel less than because of their race, their gender, or their status. Jade Montgomery was not a woman who took injustice lying down. And as the plane ascended into the sky, Jade made a silent vow, this wasn't over. The moment she landed, she would take action, and this humiliation would not go unchallenged. She had the power, the resources, and the authority to make sure of it. And as the plane climbed higher into the clouds, so did Jade's resolve. No one would make her feel small today, not without consequences rising above. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, its engines humming steadily as the landscape below faded into an endless expanse of clouds. Jade sat back in her seat, staring out the window, her mind racing with the events that had unfolded mere moments earlier. The sting of the flight attendant's treatment hadn't lessened, and in fact, it seemed to grow sharper the more she thought about it. Jade had experienced discrimination before, but this had been different. This wasn't an overt racial slur or a blatant act of exclusion. No, this had been far subtler, a quiet form of disregard that had wormed its way into the very fabric of the experience. It was insidious and disguised as something innocuous, a simple boarding pass check that had escalated unnecessarily. But Jade knew better. She knew that beneath the polite facade of a routine travel interaction, there was something deeper at play. The skepticism in the flight attendant's eyes, the sudden questioning of her presence in the cabin, all spoke to an assumption that she didn't belong. And that assumption, Jade understood all too well, was rooted in a perception of who was worthy of luxury, who was deemed fit to sit in the first-class cabin of a plane operated by an elite airline. As the plane continued its ascent, Jade felt a shift within herself. The fire that had been sparked by the treatment now simmered beneath the surface, its heat growing as the minutes passed. There was something far greater at stake than just this flight, this moment of discomfort. This was about the systemic biases that lingered in so many corners of the world, the everyday, quiet prejudices that were so often ignored or brushed aside. This was about power, identity, and the relentless pursuit of recognition in a world that often overlooked people like her. Her mother, Alexandra Montgomery, had taught her to never back down in the face of adversity, to stand tall and proud in the spaces she had earned the right to occupy. As the CEO of one of the largest airline conglomerates in the world, Alexandra had faced more than her fair share of scrutiny and doubt. Jade had watched as her mother dismantled every challenge that came her way with unwavering resolve, a quiet force of nature that commanded respect without asking for it. She'd seen firsthand the kind of resilience it took to thrive in spaces that weren't always welcoming, and it was a lesson Jade carried with her every day. But now, on this plane, in this moment, Jade realized something crucial. It wasn't just about standing tall in the face of adversity, it was about being heard, about ensuring that her voice had weight, that her presence was undeniable. She straightened in her seat, determination flickering in her chest. This would not go unchallenged. Jade Montgomery had never been one to let a slight pass by unnoticed, and today would be no different. The thought of letting this moment fade into oblivion, of allowing the slight to be forgotten, filled her with frustration. No, she would make sure that this incident would be a lesson, not just for the flight attendant but for anyone who thought they could judge her based on assumptions alone. Jade pulled out her phone, tapping the screen with a sense of purpose. She needed to make a call. She opened her contacts and quickly dialed her mother's number. Alexandra Montgomery was a woman who didn't take kindly to things that undermined her principles, and Jade knew her mother would understand exactly why this was worth addressing. The phone rang twice before her mother's familiar voice answered. "Jade, darling, is everything all right?" Alexandra's tone was warm, but Jade could hear the underlying note of concern. "I need you to listen to something, Mom," Jade said, her voice steady, but tinged with the frustration that had been simmering. "I just boarded a flight, and the flight attendant, she didn't think I belonged in first class. She questioned my seat, demanded to see my boarding pass as if I didn't have the right to be there." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before her mother responded, her voice cold and deliberate. "Tell me everything, Jade." Jade recounted the entire exchange, how the flight attendant, Victoria Sinclair, had targeted her, how she had been made to feel small, invisible, as though her presence in that space was an anomaly. As she spoke, she could hear the growing anger in her mother's voice. "Is she still there?" Alexandra asked, her tone now sharp with a clarity that only came from years of experience. "She's gone now," Jade replied, her jaw clenched tightly. "But it doesn't matter. I won't just let this slide, Mom. I need to do something about it." Her mother was silent for a moment, and Jade could practically hear her calculating the best course of action. Finally, Alexandra spoke, her voice steady and resolute. "Jade, you have a choice to make. You can let this moment pass, or you can make it something that changes not just the airline's practices but the way people see you in this industry. You have power, my dear. And people like Victoria, they need to understand that when you walk into a room, you take up space. You don't shrink for anyone. You make them see you, and you make them respect you." Jade felt a surge of pride and strength wash over her. Her mother's words were a clarion call, reminding her of the tenacity and fire she had inherited. She didn't just have power, she had influence. And more importantly, she had a voice that could bring about real change. "I'll do it, Mom," Jade said, her voice firm. "I'll handle it." She ended the call, her resolve now completely solidified. Jade knew she couldn't let this moment pass, not just for herself but for everyone who had ever been marginalized or underestimated. This wasn't about one flight attendant's mistake, it was about making a statement. The plane's captain came over the intercom, announcing that they were reaching cruising altitude, and Jade's thoughts turned to the next steps. She needed to figure out how to address the situation effectively, how to ensure that this incident didn't fade into the background like so many others had before it. She considered her options. A direct complaint to the airline's customer service would be the most obvious route, but Jade wasn't one to take the most obvious route. No, she needed something more powerful, something that would reverberate through the company's halls and get to the heart of the issue. This wasn't just about one instance of poor customer service, it was about the bigger picture, about the culture of elitism and entitlement that often pervaded high-end spaces. Jade knew that her mother would back her, no questions asked. Alexandra had spent decades carving out a space for herself in a world that had never been kind to women, and especially to black women. She knew how to take action in a way that didn't just make noise, it made an impact. Jade leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, focusing on the deep rhythm of the plane as it sliced through the sky. The discomfort from earlier had shifted into something more powerful, resolve. This wasn't just about confronting the flight attendant. It was about rewriting the rules, about taking back the narrative in a world that so often sought to diminish her. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The airline needed to know that it was not acceptable to treat customers, especially ones like her, with disdain or disrespect. As the plane glided through the clouds, Jade made her plan. She would contact the airline's executives directly, skipping the usual channels. She would demand a meeting with the heads of customer service, HR, and the in-flight operations teams. She would ensure that they understood the gravity of the situation and the kind of change that was needed. Jade had always known that change wasn't something that happened on its own. It had to be created, it had to be demanded, and most importantly, it had to be acted upon. And as she stared out the window, watching the clouds pass beneath her, Jade knew one thing for certain, this was just the beginning. Unseen forces. The remaining stretch of the flight passed by in a blur of determination. Jade's mind worked tirelessly, plotting each step in her plan. Though the plane's gentle hum was meant to soothe passengers, it was only serving to fuel the rising fire inside her. The thought of how she had been treated earlier gnawed at her. It wasn't just the indignity of it, it was the message it sent. She had worked so hard to earn the place she had in this world, and for someone to question her simply because of her race was a wound that was hard to ignore. As the plane neared its destination, Jade's resolve only deepened. The treatment had been personal, yes, but it was also part of a much larger issue. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just about her, this was about all the times people of color, women, or anyone from a marginalized group had been made to feel lesser, unseen, or unworthy. She was determined that this would not just fade away like so many other incidents. This one would have consequences, real ones, and she would make sure that those who needed to hear it would. By the time the plane landed and taxied to the gate, Jade was already planning her next move. She knew her mother would be on the phone with her in a matter of moments, ready to back her in whatever way necessary. Alexandra had always been a strategic thinker, a woman who operated in the high-stakes world of corporate power with precision and foresight. She had built her empire from the ground up, refusing to be defined by the expectations others had of her. And Jade knew that if anyone could help her navigate this situation with the force it required, it was her mother. As the passengers disembarked and filed out of the aircraft, Jade lingered in her seat for a moment. Her thoughts were consumed with her next steps. She had been given an opportunity, a rare chance to not only correct an individual's wrong but to challenge the larger, systemic forces at play within her mother's company. It was no longer enough to simply be a good employee, a high achiever, someone who could perform and be left alone. No, she wanted to change the way people saw her, and the way people saw others like her. She stood up from her seat and straightened her suit. There was no time to waste. As the last passengers made their way off the plane, Jade did the same, her pace purposeful as she walked through the jet bridge into the terminal. Her phone buzzed, signaling that her mother had reached out, and Jade answered quickly. "Mom," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'm heading straight to the CEO's office. We need to take care of this now." "Good," her mother's voice came through clearly, the authority in it unmistakable. "I've already made a few calls. We need to get ahead of this, Jade. I'm going to need you to stay calm and make sure we approach this strategically. The last thing we want is for this to spiral out of control." "I'm calm, Mom," Jade replied, though her heartbeat was quickening. "I just need to make sure the right people understand what happened. This is about more than just one flight attendant. It's about how this company, and the world at large, treats people like me." "Exactly. But don't make it personal. Focus on the bigger picture, the impact this could have on the airline's reputation, especially in light of everything that's been going on in the world lately. We don't want to appear tone-deaf." Jade nodded, even though her mother couldn't see it. "I'll be strategic, I promise. I'll make sure they understand the gravity of the situation." She ended the call and turned her attention to the terminal. Her mind raced with the possibilities. The first step was to speak with her mother's top executives, the ones who ran day-to-day operations. Alexandra's airline was a massive company, and it wasn't uncommon for issues like this to be overlooked or buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. But this time, Jade wouldn't let that happen. She had a duty to make sure the systems in place were held accountable, and more importantly, that people like Victoria Sinclair, the flight attendant who had treated her like an outsider, understood that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. Jade took a deep breath and moved toward the escalator that would take her to the ground level. The hum of the terminal and the echoing footsteps of other travelers seemed to fade as she focused on her goal. She had dealt with difficult people before, but this was different. She was no longer just a passenger on an airplane, she was a woman with power, influence, and a voice that demanded to be heard. She reached the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor, the corporate offices of the airline. As the elevator ascended, Jade reflected on the lessons her mother had imparted over the years. She had been taught that power didn't just come from your position, it came from your ability to change minds, to shift perspectives, to challenge the status quo. And Jade had always excelled in that. When the doors opened, she stepped into the sleek, minimalist lobby that led to the executive suites. The modern design, with its clean lines and muted colors, reflected the company's commitment to luxury and efficiency. But behind the polished exterior, Jade knew there were cracks, gaps in understanding, in empathy, in diversity. Her mother's company was one of the biggest in the industry, but like so many other corporations, it was riddled with the same biases and blind spots that permeated every level of society. She approached the receptionist at the desk, who greeted her with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Montgomery. How may I assist you today?" the woman asked, her voice professionally neutral. "I need to speak with Mr. Matthews immediately," Jade said, her tone brokering no argument. "It's urgent." The receptionist hesitated for a moment, clearly processing the request. Jade could see the wheels turning behind the woman's eyes. Was she questioning her authority or simply trying to determine the nature of her request? Either way, Jade didn't have time to waste on small talk. She had to act fast. Please let him know it's regarding an incident involving a flight attendant today, Jade added. I'll wait. A few minutes later, the receptionist returned with a polite nod. Mr. Matthews will see you now. Please follow me. Jade followed the receptionist down the corridor to the large office at the end. Mr. Matthews, the head of customer relations, was a tall man with graying hair and sharp features. He was one of the company's most senior executives, and Jade had worked with him in the past. He was a professional, but she could tell from the moment she stepped into his office that he wasn't expecting her. Jade, he said, rising from his desk with a slight frown. What brings you here? I need to discuss something with you, she said, her voice steady but resolute. Something that happened on a flight this morning. I was treated unfairly by a flight attendant. Mr. Matthews' brow furrowed, but he gestured for her to sit. What exactly happened? He asked, leaning forward. Jade recounted the events of the flight, the treatment she had received, the questioning of her presence in first class, and the way she had been made to feel as though she didn't belong. She emphasized that it wasn't just about the individual incident, it was about the broader issue of exclusion, elitism, and the biases that many passengers, especially people of color, faced when they traveled in these spaces. By the time she finished, Mr. Matthews was silent, his expression unreadable. But Jade could see the tension in his posture, the way his fingers drummed lightly on the desk. He wasn't dismissing her. He was listening. Jade, I understand your frustration, he said after a long pause. But I have to ask, what do you want us to do about it? I want change, Jade said firmly. This isn't just about one flight attendant. This is about a company culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. I want a full review of customer service training, I want better accountability across the board, and I want a public apology for what happened. Mr. Matthews nodded slowly, clearly taking in her words. I'll bring this up at the next board meeting, he said. And I'll make sure this is addressed. But I can't promise anything will change overnight. Change never happens overnight, Jade replied. But it starts with a commitment. And you've got one now. As she left Mr. Matthews' office, Jade felt a sense of resolve settle over her. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The system had been challenged, and it would bend to her will. She would make sure of that. A turning point. The days following Jade's meeting with Mr. Matthews were a blur of activity. She spent hours drafting emails, preparing documents, and consulting with her mother, Alexandra. The wheels of change were in motion, but Jade knew that true transformation required persistence. She had made her point to the airline's top brass, but she knew that action spoke louder than words, and it was her job to ensure that those words would be translated into meaningful results. Jade had long since made peace with the fact that change, especially within large, established institutions, was a slow process. She'd seen it firsthand through her mother's experiences. Every victory was hard-won, every inch of progress fought for with relentless determination. But this was different. This wasn't just a corporate issue, this was personal, and Jade was willing to take whatever steps were necessary to ensure that no one else would endure what she had. The conversation with Mr. Matthews had been just the beginning. It was a small but significant victory, a moment where the company had been forced to acknowledge its flaws. But Jade knew that there was more to be done. She needed to keep the pressure on, to keep reminding the airline's executives that they could not sweep this issue under the rug. Over the next few days, Jade and her mother worked tirelessly. Alexandra pulled her connections within the company, calling in favors, and making sure that the right people were paying attention. Jade, meanwhile, remained focused on her mission. She spent hours preparing her case, compiling data on the airline's customer service practices, highlighting areas where the company had failed to provide equal treatment, and pointing out the subtle but pervasive forms of discrimination that were often overlooked. She even started reaching out to fellow passengers who had been on the flight with her, hoping to get their accounts of what had happened. While most people didn't have the courage to speak out in situations like these, Jade knew that there were those who shared her experience, those who had witnessed her treatment and could offer their own testimony to back up her claims. She wanted to show that her story wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern that needed to be addressed. Through her mother's connections, Jade was introduced to a team of lawyers specializing in workplace discrimination and civil rights. She had never been one to back down from a fight, but having the support of experienced professionals gave her an added sense of confidence. They reviewed her case, helping her refine her strategy and prepare for any potential pushback. As the days turned into a week, Jade began to see the first signs of change. The airline issued a formal apology to her, not just for the incident, but for the systemic flaws in its customer service practices. But Jade knew this wasn't enough. Words without action were empty promises, and she had no intention of letting the company off the hook with a simple apology. It wasn't long before the internal reviews at the airline began, and Jade found herself at the center of heated discussions about company policy. There were those who insisted that the incident had been an isolated mistake, a misstep that didn't reflect the airline's overall values. But there were others who understood that this wasn't just about one flight attendant, it was about a larger culture of exclusion that needed to be addressed. Jade was ready for the challenge. She continued to push for concrete changes, attending meetings with the airline's executives and customer service teams. She wasn't there just to voice her concerns, she was there to demand results. It wasn't just about holding people accountable, it was about creating a culture of inclusivity, where people from all walks of life could feel like they belonged. As the weeks went by, Jade's efforts began to pay off. The airline began implementing new training programs for its employees, focusing not just on customer service but on issues of diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias. They hired outside consultants to help with the process, bringing in experts who could provide fresh perspectives on how to create a more equitable environment for both passengers and employees. But even as these changes began to take shape, Jade knew that this wasn't the end. She had made an impact, yes, but there was still more work to be done. She wanted to ensure that the airline wasn't just paying lip service to the issue of inclusivity, that the changes being made would be sustainable and would continue long after the spotlight faded from her particular incident. It was around this time that Jade received a call from an unexpected source. Victoria Sinclair, the flight attendant who had questioned her presence in first class, reached out to apologize. The tone of her voice was tentative, even vulnerable, and Jade could sense the guilt weighing on her. "I never meant to make you feel that way, Jade," Victoria said, her words coming slowly, as if she were choosing them carefully. "I was wrong, and I realize that now. I don't know what I was thinking. I've worked for this airline for years, and I've never had an issue with someone like you before." Jade felt a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. This wasn't the kind of apology she had expected, but it was genuine. She had no intention of letting Victoria off the hook completely, but there was something in her voice that suggested this wasn't a woman who had set out to hurt anyone, it was a woman who had allowed her own biases to cloud her judgment. "I appreciate your apology, Victoria," Jade replied, her voice steady but firm. "But I need you to understand that this isn't just about me. This is about the culture we live in, about how people like you and me are treated, whether we deserve it or not." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Jade could almost hear Victoria processing her words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I know. I'm sorry. I've learned a lot from this. I'm going to take the training seriously. I don't want to ever make someone feel like that again." Jade nodded, even though Victoria couldn't see it. This wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't about absolving Victoria of her actions. But it was about moving forward, about understanding that people could change, and that sometimes, change needed to come from the inside. "Good," Jade said. "I'm glad to hear that." As the call ended, Jade sat back in her chair and reflected on the journey she had taken. It had been a hard-fought battle, and there were still many challenges ahead. But this was a turning point. Her efforts were beginning to pay off, and not just in the form of company policies. The fact that Victoria had reached out was proof that the dialogue was shifting, that people were beginning to listen. Jade's story was becoming a beacon of hope, not just for herself but for countless others who had been overlooked or mistreated. She had shown that one voice, one person, could make a difference. She had shown that standing up for what was right didn't just bring change, it brought understanding. But Jade wasn't done yet. There was more work to be done, more voices to amplify, more barriers to break. She knew that this was just one small victory in the grand scheme of things. But she also knew that it was a victory worth celebrating, a step in the right direction toward a more inclusive world. With renewed resolve, Jade picked up her phone and dialed her mother's number. "Mom," she said when Alexandra picked up. "We've got work to do." The power of persistence. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, follow-ups, and strategizing. The momentum Jade had built from her initial confrontation with the flight attendant, Victoria Sinclair, continued to grow, but Jade knew that real change wasn't something that could happen overnight. It was a slow process that required tireless effort, and for every small victory, there were 10 more hurdles to overcome. Jade found herself deeply immersed in the airline's internal restructuring processes. She sat in on brainstorming sessions where ideas about diversifying the company's hiring practices were discussed. She reviewed the content of the new training programs being rolled out to staff, ensuring they weren't just corporate speak but genuinely reflected the realities of what it meant to be a marginalized passenger. For her, every detail mattered. It wasn't enough to change a few policies or put out a press release. This needed to become ingrained in the culture. The changes weren't without resistance. There were murmurs of discontent among some long-time employees, particularly those who had been with the company for years. Some felt threatened by the sudden push toward inclusion, seeing it as a disruption of the status quo. Others were simply unaware of how their biases had affected the experiences of passengers who didn't look like them. But Jade remained resolute. She was prepared to face this head-on. Her mother, Alexandra, played an integral role in all of this. She had always been a strategic thinker, and she knew how to navigate the corporate world with precision. But Jade's involvement in the process brought something new to the table, a personal, human element that the company had never seen before. Alexandra saw the strength in her daughter's approach, and her influence helped Jade's message resonate with the top-level executives in ways that a memo or corporate initiative never could. In meetings with senior leadership, Jade spoke candidly about the company's history, about how they had often turned a blind eye to issues of inequality, and how it was now time to face those issues head-on. She didn't mince words. She knew that to have a real impact, she had to speak plainly, cut through the corporate doublespeak, and make it clear that this was no longer just a diversity initiative, it was a matter of social responsibility. But there were challenges, too. The initial steps were met with a great deal of skepticism from certain corners of the business. Many executives, though sympathetic to the cause, didn't fully understand how deeply systemic these issues were. They wanted to know what the tangible outcomes would be, how they could measure the success of the new initiatives, and whether the company would truly benefit from this approach. But Jade had anticipated these questions. She came prepared with data, stories, and insights that connected the dots between an inclusive culture and long-term profitability. As a result, one of the first significant actions taken was the creation of an inclusion task force. The task force was charged with overseeing the implementation of the new diversity and training programs, gathering feedback from employees and customers, and identifying areas where the airline still fell short. It was a major step forward, and Jade was appointed as a liaison between the task force and the board of directors. She had a direct line to her mother, but she had also earned the trust of the rest of the leadership team. Her role was one of both facilitator and advocate. She listened to the concerns of employees, both those who were enthusiastic about the changes and those who felt threatened by them. She met with staff members from every department, from flight attendants to customer service agents, to ensure that the training was as impactful as it could be. She shared her own experiences with the airline's leadership, demonstrating that the journey toward equality was not always linear. It involved setbacks, missteps, and moments of discomfort. But Jade was convinced that if they pushed through those moments, they could create a lasting, positive change. It wasn't just about policies, it was about people. It was about making sure that no one ever felt like Jade had felt that day on the plane. No one should ever feel less than, invisible, or as though they didn't belong. She wanted the airline's employees to look at their customers and see human beings, not stereotypes or assumptions. She wanted them to approach every interaction with empathy, respect, and understanding. But not everyone shared Jade's sense of urgency. Some of the airline's corporate leaders were patient, but there were others who wanted to see quick results. There were murmurs about the need for the company to prove its commitment to diversity through visible action, but Jade wasn't interested in half measures or token gestures. She knew this was about more than just making a few cosmetic changes to the company's public image. It was about creating a new standard for how employees treated one another and how customers were treated, regardless of their background, race, or gender. At times, Jade found herself exhausted by the endless meetings and the pressure to ensure everything went smoothly. But when she looked at the changes already in motion, when she saw the board's commitment to making real, tangible improvements, she felt invigorated. There was still much to do, but she knew she was on the right path. And every day, it felt as though the world was waking up, too. Her personal life, however, was starting to take a back seat. Jade had always been a driven, ambitious person, but she was beginning to feel the strain. She hadn't taken a real break in weeks, and as much as she loved the work she was doing, she also missed the quiet moments of solitude and the opportunity to focus on herself. She hadn't had time to meet friends, spend time with her family outside of business discussions, or even just enjoy the simple things she used to love, like walking around the city or having a cup of coffee in peace. One evening, after a particularly grueling series of meetings, Jade decided to take a breather. She needed some space to clear her mind, so she called up her best friend, Camille, who had always been a grounding influence. "Camille, do you want to go grab dinner?" "I need a break," Jade asked, her voice tired but light. Camille, who had always been the first to push Jade to relax, didn't hesitate. "Of course. Let's do it. You deserve a night off." They met at a quiet Italian restaurant, one of their favorite spots, where they could talk without distractions. Camille listened patiently as Jade vented about the challenges she was facing, the slow pace of change, and the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. Jade spoke about the resistance within the company, the skepticism that some of the executives still held toward the initiatives. She told Camille about the pressure she felt to succeed, not just for herself, but for everyone who was counting on her to change the system. "You know," Camille said thoughtfully, "this whole thing isn't just about the airline anymore. It's about you, about how you're redefining what success looks like. You're not just fixing a broken system, you're making sure no one else has to fight these battles alone." Jade took a deep breath. "I never thought of it like that. I mean, I knew I was doing this for more than just myself, but sometimes it's hard to keep that in perspective." "That's the thing," Camille continued. "You're setting an example. Whether you realize it or not, you're changing the future, not just for the people who work for that airline but for everyone who's been treated unfairly in the past." Jade smiled, the weight on her shoulders feeling just a little lighter. "Thanks, Camille. I needed to hear that." As the night wore on, Jade realized that the journey she was on was not just about external victories, it was also about internal growth. She was learning to balance the intensity of her professional life with the needs of her personal life. She was learning to trust in the process, knowing that while the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, the destination was worth the effort. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Meeting with the board tomorrow. I'll need you to lead the conversation on diversity." Jade felt a rush of determination. It wasn't just about winning battles, it was about creating a future where people like her, people who had been overlooked or misunderstood, could rise to the highest levels without fear. She was ready. Ready to speak. Ready to lead. Ready to make history. Legacy of change. The following weeks felt like a blur of activity, filled with strategic meetings, tough decisions, and long hours of reflection. Jade had become an integral force in the reshaping of the airline's internal culture. With her mother's support and her position at the head of the Inclusion Task Force, she was influencing changes at every level, from corporate strategy down to employee training. But as much as she was involved, Jade found herself increasingly burdened by the enormity of the task at hand. Each step forward felt like it brought a new set of obstacles to face, and the weight of responsibility hung heavier on her shoulders every day. One morning, as Jade sipped her coffee in the quiet solitude of her office, she received an unexpected call from a reporter. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't sure if it was the right time for her story to be shared so publicly. But something inside her urged her to take the call. This wasn't just about her personal journey anymore, it was about setting a precedent for future generations. It was about showing the world that progress was possible, and that no one should be made to feel like they didn't belong. "Ms. Montgomery," the reporter began, her voice professional but warm, "we've been following the developments surrounding the changes at your airline. We understand you've played a pivotal role in shifting the company's culture, especially regarding diversity and inclusion. Can you share a little more about what these changes mean for the industry at large?" Jade thought for a moment before responding. For too long, the airline industry, and, frankly, many industries, have allowed discrimination to persist in subtle, insidious ways. What we're doing now is about dismantling those old systems. It's not just about what's right for the company's bottom line, it's about what's right for the people we serve. Every passenger, no matter their race, gender, or background, should feel seen and respected when they step onto a plane. We are making that a reality. The reporter pressed on, asking Jade about the specifics of the training programs, how they were being implemented, and whether they had made a tangible difference in the short time they'd been introduced. Jade shared stories of success, of flight attendants and staff members who had already begun to embrace the new values and how the company was actively seeking feedback from customers. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but the changes were happening. By the time the interview ended, Jade felt a renewed sense of purpose. Talking about the changes in a public forum reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place. She had been pushed into the spotlight, but she was using it to shine a light on something much bigger than herself. That afternoon, Jade made her way to the airport to meet with senior leadership for another board meeting. The mood was noticeably more positive than it had been months earlier. People were starting to see the benefits of the initiatives Jade had helped implement. The atmosphere had shifted from one of reluctant compliance to enthusiastic support. The conversation around the table was no longer about whether the changes were needed, it was about how they could accelerate the transformation and set new benchmarks for the industry. One of the senior executives, Michael Thompson, a seasoned leader who had once expressed skepticism about the need for such deep systemic change, stood up to speak. "I have to admit, I wasn't sure at first," he said, his voice humble. "But what we've seen in the last few months is undeniable. Not only are we attracting a more diverse clientele, but we're also seeing a shift in employee morale. People feel seen, and they're willing to go the extra mile for a company that values them. Jade, you've been an incredible force for this transformation." Jade's heart swelled with pride, but she knew it wasn't just her. This was a collective effort. Her voice had been the one to spark the change, but it had taken the commitment of so many others, her mother, the employees, the leadership team, and the passengers who had shared their own stories of discrimination to bring this vision to life. "It's been a team effort," Jade responded, standing tall as she addressed the room. "But we're not done yet. The changes we've made are important, but they're just the beginning. We've started a new chapter, and we need to make sure this continues long after the spotlight fades. This is about creating lasting, meaningful change in every corner of this company." The board members nodded in agreement, but Jade knew that the real work was still ahead. The airline had made significant strides, but in her heart, Jade understood that this wasn't just about the airline. This was a fight for equality that stretched far beyond the walls of any corporation. She was part of a much larger movement that was calling for systemic change, not just in the airline industry, but across the world. In the months that followed, Jade became a sought-after speaker at diversity and inclusion conferences. Her story was one of resilience, empowerment, and the importance of standing up in the face of injustice. She spoke about her experience as a black woman in a space where she had felt overlooked and disrespected, and how she had used that experience to fuel her determination to change the system. She spoke about the challenges she faced, the pushback she received, and the moments of doubt that threatened to derail her progress. But she also spoke about the victories, the small wins that proved that change was possible, and how the airline's transformation had inspired her to push further, to not just fight for herself, but for others who had been silenced for too long. Through it all, Jade remained grounded. She knew that the road ahead would be long, but she was ready. She continued to work with the airline's executives, guiding them as they navigated the complexities of implementing real change. The company's efforts were now being noticed in the media and by industry insiders, and Jade's leadership was becoming a model for how businesses could transform their cultures and embrace diversity in a way that was both meaningful and sustainable. Jade knew that her mother, Alexandra, had played an instrumental role in all of this. Without her guidance and unwavering support, Jade would never have had the platform or the resources to make such a significant impact. But even more than that, Alexandra had given Jade the confidence to speak her truth, to confront the injustices she had experienced, and to fight for something better. One day, after a particularly successful meeting with the airline's global leadership team, Jade received a message from an old friend. It was Camille, her best friend, who had always been there for her, whether she was celebrating victories or weathering storms. "Jade," the message read. "I just wanted to say I'm so proud of you. You've changed so many lives. And you've done it all while staying true to who you are. You're not just fighting for the right to be seen, you're fighting for the right to thrive. Keep going. The world needs more people like you." Jade smiled as she read the words. They were a reminder of why she had started this journey, to change not just her life, but the lives of countless others who had been overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. She had become a symbol of what was possible when resilience met purpose, when one person decided to stand up for what was right and demand the respect that everyone deserved. As Jade looked out over the city from her office window, she realized that she had already accomplished so much. But in her heart, she knew that the journey was far from over. There were still many challenges to face, many battles to fight. But Jade was no longer just a woman trying to change a company, she was a movement, a force of nature, and she would continue to fight for equality, empowerment, and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves a seat at the table. With renewed determination, Jade stood up from her desk, ready for whatever came next. Because the work was never truly done. And she was just getting started.